Welcome to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you burn fat, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Hey everyone, I'm excited to talk about health rebuilding practices with Ryan Monahan today, one of my mentors and guides in my FDN Practitioner program, helping me learn more always. Thank you, Ryan, for coming on this show and talking more about health, optimization, as well as how we can improve our athletic performance. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. So happy to be here.
So Ryan, I always start the show. I always like to ask people, what's your story? What's your why? And talk about what you do and how you got there, your journey. So I'll let you just take it over and just talk about who you are.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I had spent the majority of my 20s as a touring and performing musician. It was really the path in life that I was on. And like many people that encounter chronic illness, it just kind of hit me. And I had never expected to go down this path of becoming a healer and a functional practitioner. So life had other plans for me, right? And what happened was that in 2012, I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's after a long, very long, decade-long journey of seeking answers to try to find out what was going on with my health. And I was dealing with chronic fatigue, brain fog, depression, all kinds of other seemingly disparate symptoms that seemed like they didn't have anything to do with each other, right? So I had these weird skin lesions that were showing up on my hands and on my earlobes. I was getting these rashes in my abdomen. I was only going to the bathroom every 3 days, which is not right. Yeah. And so things just kind of continued to progressively get worse. It really started in my college years, actually, but I just had attributed that to burning the candle at both ends, having a full-time course load. I was also working 2 different jobs to pay my way through college. I was also playing in different performance groups and bands and touring around the Northeast. And I did a lot. I had a lot on my life philosophy was, that I'll sleep when I'm dead, right? And so I probably got an average of 4 or 5 hours of sleep for the 4 years that I was in college. So I was definitely not taking care of myself. And unfortunately, all of those issues continue to get progressively worse, especially my allergy issues, which we'll come back to because it's going to tie into the topic that we're going to talk about today. But for years and years, I was on every antihistamine drug you could think of: Allegra, Zyrtec, Flonase, different inhalers. And at various times throughout the year, I'd be on rounds of prednisone, of steroid drugs, because the congestion in my sinuses would get so bad that I couldn't breathe through my nose. It felt at times like there was a tennis ball lodged inside of my sinuses.
Wow, that sounds horrible.
And it really affected my self-esteem too, because I was a mouth breather, and I would always have, when I'd be having a conversation, I'd be sneezing all the time. I'd be having mucus running down the front of my face and constantly sneezing and wiping my nose. So it was debilitating, right? This wasn't your just average run-of-the-mill, mild allergy issue. There were times where I would describe them as sneezing fits, where I would sneeze, 20 times within a few minutes, just over and over and again. And that, that started to affect kind of my energy levels and my cognitive function. And I couldn't, it was so bad between that and these other issues with the chronic fatigue and the brain fog, I couldn't work full time. It just wasn't even possible, right? There were the times when I would try to hold down a job, I'd have to leave. I just was in such bad shape that I would need to go home and rest and take care of myself. So I found myself in the situation where for many years, I kind of self-isolated. That kind of caused my self-esteem and depression to further spiral downward. just because I had no idea what was going on with my health. I was bouncing around between all these different doctors and specialists, and nothing was getting better. In fact, everything was getting worse. And it was about a decade of this. At one point, I had been recommended or referred to a grand rounds at Yale New Haven Hospital. And I had been seen by 40 medical students in one day. Yeah, just kind of almost like as an experiment, to test their growing medical knowledge and to see if they could try to piece together what I was going through and come up with some kind of diagnosis. And the end result of that was that there was no determination at all, actually, about what was going on. And I still have a copy of the report that basically says in medical language that we don't see any serious health issues with Ryan. He appears to be good health.
You're normal.
I'm normal despite being depressed and sleeping 12 hours a day, and not being able to breathe through my nose. And all these other things, right? Yeah. So even after that time, it was still several more years. I believe it was 4 or 5 more years after that it took for me to get a Hashimoto's diagnosis, right? So, and during that time period, it was miserable. I thought I was dying. I had no idea what was going on. And at the time I was finally diagnosed with Hashimoto's, my thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, was at a 150. And for your listeners that aren't familiar with TSH, it's a hormone produced by the pituitary gland. It's a signaling hormone that is produced by the pituitary gland to signal the thyroid to produce thyroid hormone, which is then responsible for upregulating all of these metabolic processes, right? Mm-hmm. So the optimal range for TSH is roughly between 0.5 to 2 or 0.5 to 2.5. And the higher the number, it's kind of a reverse or inverse marker. The higher the number, the slower your metabolism, basically. So it gets a little more complicated than that, but that's kind of strokes, right? So roughly we're looking at a 0.5 to 2.5 optimal, and I was at a 150.
Whoa.
For some perspective on where I was at in terms of my thyroid health, right? I was kind of like almost in a metabolic coma, right? And the doctor basically explained to me, he said, I have no idea how you've even been able to get up out of bed in the morning. That's really how it felt for so many years. And it was mostly sheer willpower that was just getting me through.
So it's almost like having mono, just forever.
Yeah, it was like permanent mono. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, and there were days where it was so bad where I couldn't get out of bed. I would just be resting in bed and, just trying to kind of get through, but I was definitely not thriving. I was just surviving. Right? Mm-hmm. So I would never wish that upon anybody, especially for as long as I had to deal with it. I often say that it feels like I lost out on my entire 20s to chronic illness. Like that decade gone. Yeah.
So when doctors test thyroid, what do they do that traditional medicine, Western medicine, they wouldn't identify seeing TSH as such a high number, not even see that as a clue to some dysfunction in your hormones?
Well, the problem was up until that point, no doctor had ever run TSH for me. Partially because it's traditionally thought of as a woman's disease, like thyroid hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's. Statistically speaking, it is about 7 to 10 times more in women, but men do develop thyroid issues as well. You have to wonder if those numbers are skewed because of the fact that men might be more reluctant to see a doctor if they're dealing with a health issue. They might be more likely to try to push through it. So you have to wonder how many potentially, hundreds of thousands or millions of men are undiagnosed with thyroid issue.
Yeah. So fast forward from that experience, you started diving in deeper, what you do now, maybe share about what your role is now and what your purpose and passion is and mission.
Yeah. So my passion and mission is to help spread the good word of functional health and nutrition. And and empowering people to reverse their chronic illness with natural protocols and diet and lifestyle. And I work with autoimmune clients all over the world to help them to manage their autoimmune conditions. A lot of Hashimoto's folks in that category, of course, right? And of course, that can range between lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, all kinds of different various autoimmune conditions. But what we find at their core is that between all of those autoimmune conditions, people are dealing with dysfunction in the body, right, at its core, right? So ultimately what I'm doing with clients is working like a detective to try to put together all of these clues and pieces of the puzzle to try to figure out what is triggering their autoimmune condition, right? So it has to kind of start with this initial idea or presupposition that your autoimmune condition is actually a symptom of something deeper in the body. Right? That the traditional conventional approach, if you're diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, you'll be told that there's nothing you can do about it. And in the case of Hashimoto's, just take this Synthroid or other form of thyroid hormone replacement and just move on with your life, right? And actually, that is what I did for the first year or so after I was diagnosed, until a lot of my symptoms started coming back. And that's when I started to question whether there couldn't be more to be done to potentially kind of reverse or at least manage my Hashimoto's, right? And it didn't take long to come into some research and support for supporting Hashimoto's and using these various different modalities and protocols, right? So I've been able to successfully put my own Hashimoto's into remission, and I see it all the time. It's totally possible, right? That if we can really do this deep investigative work and we can look at hormones and detoxification and gut health and liver health and inflammation and all these different factors that can drive dysfunction in the body, we can reverse those processes, right? They're not static, right? The body's always changing, right? So the only thing that is constant is change, which means that the thing that we're in a permanent disease state is kind of silly, right? Because we can modulate or change what's going on in our environment.
That's perfect. I think that's a thing. A lot of people, one, blame the aging process if they don't feel good and think it's their new normal, that they'll just deal with it. And also, sadly, we go to the doctor and they'll get medication and it's just putting a Band-Aid on and not really figuring out the why. Why is this happening? And as FDN practitioners, as you are and myself, that we investigate the different kind of unpeel the onion and get a little bit deeper to find the contributors to it. But it's sad that so many people just settle and they don't strive to thrive instead of survive each day, as you said. I always say the same thing.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And that's why this approach can potentially be life-changing. And it changed my life. And that's what kind of, led me to become a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner and ultimately become the person that I wish I had helping me when I was at the bottom with my health, right? Because I didn't have anyone that approached me and said, okay, let's look at every single possible piece of the puzzle and, do this very thorough health investigation and actually get to the root of what's going on, right?
Do you find most practitioners are the same? Sorry to interrupt, but do you find every week, because that's the same for me. I want to do this because no one could help me look at the whole picture and put all these labs, all these assessments together and looking at your personality and lifestyle habits.
Yeah. And I think that's something that's unique to FDNs, is that we, really unturn every stone, right? And not just with the lab investigation, but also looking at all of these foundational health principles like diet and optimizing sleep, optimizing, an appropriate amount of movement and exercise, based on the health of that individual, stress reduction, mindset. All of this stuff is important. And so we're really looking back far into the client's history and looking at, okay, was the client on dozens of rounds of antibiotics as a child? Did they have different kinds of surgery? Did they have their gallbladder removed? Was there some kind of significant trauma when all of their symptoms started, right? So all of it's relevant. We're definitely not just trying to work at the symptom level to just kind of suppress symptoms in the short term. We're really looking to fully restore function to the body and get people optimized, right? And live an optimized life. And to take it a step beyond that, it's not even just about living a life that's absent of symptoms.
Yeah.
About what you're going to do with that health, right? Are you going to do a triathlon? Are you going to start a business? Are you going to start a family? Do you want to travel more? Do you want to, be an artist and write an album or make some artwork, right? These are things that people are prevented from doing because they're constantly living with chronic illness that's just kind of looming over on a day-to-day basis. And sadly, so many people that come to me, and I'm sure you experience the same thing, they're not able to live the life that they want to live because they're just constantly getting by and they're just trying to manage.
Yeah, I'm just writing that down. You want to be able to live the life you want to live. And I think tying this all together to the athlete, the driven, ambitious, high-performing individual, but also athlete, that's a type A to triple A personality. They want to know, how to improve in their triathlon or the marathon time. But what I'm trying to get the message across to everyone, if they read my book I wrote 5 years ago, Life is Not a Race, it is a journey. I talked all about, me going from top athlete to 3 months later, 30 pounds heavy, having naps every day. So it's kind of figuring out, yes, I want to do well in a race next year. And people get so focused on training and racing, except for this year, there's no races, but just racing virtually, that really, I want to stress the importance of optimizing your health, as you could be digging yourself into a hole. As you and I have talked about my own case, that I didn't just fall apart February, March 2013. It's what was going on 5 years leading up to that date that I feel like it's my mission and purpose to educate other athletes that are driven and ambitious as myself, not to go through that. It's like, hey, there's all these red flags. You're just going by them, have no idea. You just passed by it. And the importance of taking lab testing and investigating now, okay, here's what I'm doing. Maybe I feel fine, but could I be better?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and our body has limits too. And this is something I see with high performance athletes that come to me as clients, is that you're pushing their cortisol, their stress hormones, to the limits, right? And that eventually, if you do that long enough, you're going to burn out. It's like driving your car with the accelerator pedal to the floor, and you might feel great doing that for a certain amount of time. Cortisol is a stress hormone, but it's also anti-inflammatory, right? So you actually might feel great when you have high cortisol. You might feel like super, right? But after enough time, just like if you're driving with your pedal to the floor, you can burn out and you'll run out of gas, right? So we also have to balance that out with self-care and periods of rest, right? And, making sure we're getting a nutrient-dense diet, and that we also incorporate stress reduction. And we also have plenty of rest and sleep to repair and recover from all of that high intensity, right? I even see, I'm sure, with high performance athletes, there's lots of oxidative stress going on, right? If you're over exercising, that is such a thing. There is a limit, right? And that can result in excessive oxidative stress, which can cause a lot of cellular damage and accelerated aging, right? So I'm sure, no one wants to accelerate their aging. So we have to find that Goldilocks zone, right? Too much, not too little. And that could be a general theme in the body if you look at just about any aspect of health, right? Any kind of nutrient or hormone. Too little can cause problems. Too much of a good thing can also cause problems.
So I say that all the time, the Goldilocks effect, and I wrote that in my book 5 years ago in the Holistic Method Manual. It's everything we do is that yin and yang, Goldilocks effect, not too much, not too little, just that right amount. But that is so individual per person. What is the right amount of stressors that they can take that doesn't give them across that tipping point that they break down and burn out from the inside out. But I think the other thing I was going to say is I wrote my book, and I think a lot of listeners that follow me know this by now, but I was at the time when I had my issues start appearing, obviously in 2013, I was doing low carb. I wasn't eating processed foods. I was totally into health and nutrition. I was fasting, doing fasted workouts. I was doing bulletproof coffee because it just started, 10 years ago. And so I was doing all that, but too much. It's that same thing. It's like a little bit's good, but for endurance athletes that are training, I was, 20 hours a week working out and training as a trainer and a fitness instructor, plus doing my own competitive hours with Mark Allen, elite level. But it's not, more is not better is my point. I would say more is not better, less can cause deficiencies, more can cause these, toxic results. So it is the right amount for everyone.
Absolutely.
More is not better.
Yep, definitely. It's all about balance. And, a lot of people that come to me, since I am working in the autoimmune population, there's so many people are dealing with chronic fatigue, right? And being, a high performance athlete might be kind of like a far off journey for them. Sometimes you have to take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Yeah. And for those folks, the best option is often really to take it slow. Even if that's some gentle yoga, walking 20 minutes a day, but definitely not like high intensity interval training or anything too intense, right? You have to kind of sometimes work with what you have and work where you're at, and eventually, you can get to a point where you can push your limits a little more, but that's not so. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, that everyone's in a different place, and a keto diet for one person may be really harmful or detrimental to somebody else. And ideally, we can look at some of these labs and biomarkers and help someone to kind of best optimize what they're trying to achieve.
Well, that's kind of where I want to go into next, is tie this together. Obviously, we need to work on our nutrition, our rest and recovery, repair, exercise the right amount, not too much, not too little, allowing some lower intensity recovery days as well as harder days, and stress reduction. But there's these external and internal stressors, and we don't know about these internal stressors because they're hidden unless we do the functional lab testing. And that's what I really want to stress and kind of vary our topics in the next few months about the different lab testing that we do and how we can reveal or identify these different stressors that you have no idea about, as we've been talking about mold toxicity. And you would just keep going through life and not realize you're at 50% capacity and where you could be running at 100%. It's just mind-boggling to me that we don't all do these labs, and it's investment in your health, but it's just amazing information we can reveal.
Yeah, exactly. So, and what I had found going back to my Hashimoto's journey, that after I had started on taking thyroid medication, at first I felt amazing, right? But then a lot of my symptoms started to creep back in. And as I alluded to earlier, that's when I started to suspect that there could be something deeper going on. And long story short, that's ultimately what led me to the FDN training, to wanting to uncover some of these hidden stressors and see if there was something deeper going on, right? So it took me many years to actually figure this out. But at the time, I was actually living in a house in the Southeast. It was an older home that was built in the 1930s. And it had always had a kind of a musty smell. I had always noticed that, right? But I had never really thought twice about it. And I just thought, it's an older house. Older houses have this kind of characteristic musty smell to it, like you'd think of
grandma.
Yeah. Okay, so turns out that that's not a good thing ever. That musty smell is a sign of a mold issue, right, in the house, like a serious mold issue, right? And I had lived in this house for nearly 10 years, right? And this was actually the house that I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's while living in this house. So I actually suspect that, and of course, there's many factors that can contribute to chronic illness or disease, but I do suspect that the mold issue was a huge, very significant driver, or perhaps even the tipping point for me developing an autoimmune condition. Just because what I had ended up finding out through functional lab testing was that I had mold colonization in my gut. So the environment that I was living in was reflected in my physiology, right? So I had pretty massive mold overgrowth in my system, which was also leading to a high degree of mycotoxicity. So these mold spores, you can breathe them in. They can colonize your sinuses. They can make their way down into your gastrointestinal tract, and various different forms of mold can colonize your gut environment, and they start producing toxins called mycotoxins, right? And it's in nature, it's the way that fungal species and mold colonies, they protect themselves by producing toxins. The trouble is that they are highly, I would say massively inflammatory to the body when these molds start producing these mold toxins, right? You kind of are dealing with a few issues when you're living with a mold in a moldy environment. You're dealing with the mold issue in the home itself. That can quickly lead to colonization in your own system. And then the mold itself leads towards this high level of mycotoxins, which not only do they lead towards chronic inflammation in the body, which is its own problem, they can also severely suppress immune function. Okay, so then once that happens, this is kind of a domino effect, right? It's that inflammatory cascade that we talk about as FDN. Once the immune system is suppressed, that makes you an ideal host, meaning it can make you vulnerable to all types of other infections. So a pattern I'll often see in someone with mold illness and their lab work is that they're dealing with a full house of issues, between hormone dysregulation to detoxification issues, but then all kinds of pathogens too in their system, right? So you'll see someone with mold illness with like several different parasites and the mold and the fungal overgrowth itself. You might see viruses like Epstein-Barr virus get kind of kicked back up, kind of get retroactivated. You might see SIBO or other forms of bacterial overgrowth and dysbiosis. So it's unfortunately, mold is pretty more common than we'd like to think, but it can also lead towards a lot of dysfunction in the body. But yet, so many people are completely unaware that this is even an issue, or that this is even the reason why they're on 12 different prescription medications, right? It could actually have a common root in the environment that they're living in.
So do you think a lot of people, you're having mold in your house first and you're inhaling it wherever you have mold exposure, but you're breathing it in and you're bringing in those mold or creating a new community and you're the host to these new mold toxins. They're creating toxins, the mycotoxins, which are creating inflammation, which are lowering your immune system, which then you can get blastohominus, whatever pathogen. Then you're just open to whatever that's around you, and you just can get all these imbalances.
And I had all of that. So through the years, Blastocystis hominis, which is a type of a protozoan parasite. Yeah. I've had Candida overgrowth. I've had C. diff. I've had H. pylori.
Me too.
Different types of bacterial overgrowth like Klebsiella, right? So I've dealt with that, right?
So you thought the mold came first, though, and then you got like all this stuff, and you can just assume.
If I had known for those years that I was dealing with a mold issue, in hindsight, it would have made more sense to me, like why my immune system was so dysfunctional was actually, I believe that the mold was the initial domino or the tipping point. Because for years I had been working on, using various herbal protocols and approaches to address the blasto and the H. pylori and all these other things that came up, the Candida. And I would always have a little bit of progress here and there, but I would still kept hitting a wall with my symptoms, right? And mold is a big topic. There was a lot I did to recover from mold illness, but ultimately, long story short, at the end of the day, it was when I finally figured out that I was dealing with mold illness, or I was on that spectrum of mold illness, and did some remediation to the home. Eventually, after some time, we ended up moving and relocating. And it was through those efforts that made the biggest overall difference in my overall improvement in my health, just night and day, right? And that's the thing about these kind of functional lab interpretation approaches of kind of deeper, right? Because you really have to dig at it. It could take time, but definitely in working with someone who's knowledgeable in these areas that can help you get better quicker and fast track you, right? Someone who's been through these things themselves, right? Whether it's autoimmunity or a mold issue. Because I had spent so many years just kind of trying to guess and trial and error, throwing a dart at the board, hoping it landed on the bullseye. But it just wasn't getting anywhere. And, if I had a time machine, I'd go back, and I, probably never would have moved into that house, first of all, but hey, it's also given me this enormous body of knowledge about mold and how it affects the body, and it's been able to help me to help other people to figure these things out for themselves too, and avoid the path that I went down.
Well, I would say everything happens for a reason. So we share, you have this passion you want to share with others because you want to help them avoid going through what you did for 10 years. Same with myself. And it's always, getting someone to look at the whole picture, because I did the same thing. I saw, and I wrote this in my book without knowing what I know now, which is a t-shirt I have. I wish I knew now what I knew then. But it's, what I want to talk about next is why don't we just do one lab or two labs? Why do we want to get 3 to 5 functional labs and choose from them? Because I went through, 8, 9 different doctors trying to get, results, trying to get help. I feel like, same thing, get stuck in that cycle of trial and error, just get supplements to treat the lab results. And really, until this year, found out from this lab, that organic acid lab, about mold toxicity. It's like, well, darn it, if someone I did so many labs. I have a whole 3-ring binder of all the labs. Why didn't we ever do all these main basic ones 8 years ago, 2000, and so that's what's, I feel strongly about everyone, instead of just 1 or 2 labs, yes, maybe you can do 2, but 3 labs is great, but you always need another one. So talk about, the labs and why you don't just run 1 lab, why we don't treat lab results, and how we kind of look as an FDN perspective.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I often like to make really simple analogies. And one analogy I'll make with a client that I'm initially onboarding or working with, in kind of the reasoning behind why we want to run a handful of foundational labs, is if you were to imagine ordering a puzzle. You order a puzzle on Amazon and it comes in the mail, and you open the box and there's only one puzzle piece in the box, right? You obviously feel kind of gypped because you're like, I've only got this one puzzle piece, right? But because there's only one puzzle piece in the box, you would not be able to tell, is this a train? Is it a bunny? Is it a bowl of fruit? Right? You'd have no idea what the picture is you're looking at, right? So it's very much the same with lab work. Each lab has its strengths and its weaknesses. And some labs specialize in looking at hormones. Some specialize in looking at gut function. Some specialize looking at immune health. Some specialize looking at food sensitivities. But because we're one body, last time I checked, right? We're one system, one body, everything is interconnected. None of these processes, whether it's hormones or detoxification or gut function or brain health, none of these processes work in isolation from each other, right? So if you're running only 1 or even 2 labs, you're kind of doing a disservice to that person, because you're not able to see how all the dots in the crime scene are interconnected, right? So it's like when you see footage of a detective in a movie, they've got all the clues pointing to each other, and the strings are attached to all the different puzzle pieces, right? That's kind of what we're doing in doing this very thorough analysis, so that we're not missing anything, right? You might experience an instance where one lab doesn't really show you all that much at all. I'm sure you've you've encountered, right? Where, you expect maybe like, oh, I'm pretty sure we're going to find SIBO or a parasite. And it's like, actually, no, that's not what we found out. But that's also why we test and we don't guess, right? Because if we look hard enough and deep enough, if you're dealing with chronic symptoms or some kind of diagnosis or chronic disease, you look hard enough, you're going to find something eventually, right? And it may not be on that first lab, it may not be on that second lab, but eventually, you're going to find something there, right? That's going to correlate with why that person is feeling that way, or what may have led them towards developing that issue or that condition. So, it's really about looking at all of these pieces. And another reason that this is important is because you often hear this term in the functional world of a root cause, right? I would actually somewhat disagree with that. I would say that there's for most people, there's not a root cause. There's a bunch of causes. Right? It's more like of a web of causes that are all interconnected, right? So I've been saying recently that illness or chronic symptoms is kind of like death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
So it's like the aggregate of a bunch of different stressors. It's like a bucket that fills up, right? You've got pathogens, you've got food sensitivities, you've got toxins like mold toxins or heavy metals or glyphosate and other kinds of pesticides in the system. And that bucket keeps filling up. And yes, our bodies are resilient and they're meant to handle a certain amount of stress, but eventually the bucket fills up, it spills over, it topples over, right? And that's when we start to end up with chronic symptoms, when our body can't maintain homeostasis or balance anymore.
I love the beaker of stress analogy, and piles that up but looking at from an internal perspective versus external, because most people look at, you have financial stress, you have COVID stress right now. I don't know how people have kids, and homeschooling while working is another new stress for people. And then you have people that overtraining stress or undertraining. I mean, there's just so many different external stressors, especially in our world right now. And that's a whole nother load on your beaker. And all those internal ones you just listed, people don't even have any clue about unless they reveal them with the lab testing. So what labs do you prefer to do? I know everyone's different. What labs they like running for? Do you have like 3 main to 5 main functional lab tests you like running with your clients?
Yeah, I do. Absolutely. And this has changed and evolved as it right? I'm always kind of for, to kind of stay on the cutting edge and making sure I'm, always up to date on the best technology and lab testing methodology. That being said, at the moment, the most common labs I would run on most clients would be a GI map, which is a DNA PCR based test that can identify various different pathogens in the gut, and it could also look at intestinal health. So it can look at how well you're digesting, how well you're detoxing, could even identify gluten sensitivity. So there's a bunch of extra goodies on that test. I run HTMA testing, which looks at mineral balance in the body and can also identify heavy metals like mercury, aluminum, arsenic, etc. Organic acid testing, that one to me is such a valuable test. There's 76 markers on that test. It looks at everything from overgrowth of different kinds of mold species to oxalate metabolism issues to Krebs cycle and energy production, like kind of how well you're converting your macronutrients into energy. Markers for detoxification, neurotransmitters. So you get a lot of value, a lot of insights into that test. And that's one of the best tests for identifying a mold pattern too, by the way. So I run that now on every client because I see mold so commonly, right? Probably in a good 20 or 30% of my clients, which is shocking, right? And it's not to say everyone has full-blown mold illness with a capital M, but there can be a degree. There's a spectrum. So someone might have some mold colonization. It might not be so severe, but it's really common to see at least something going on there. Dutch hormone testing, looking at estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, stress hormones like cortisol, And then blood chemistry is a really integrated part of my practice, and looking at how some blood chemistry biomarkers might be correlated with all these other lab tests. But those would probably be my core tests. And occasionally I'll run like a wheat zoomer or other food sensitivity testing. Occasionally, if I see signs of mold colonization, I will run a mycotox profile from Great Plains, which can look at the presence of mycotoxins in the body. So depending on the client, there are other things I may want to consider looking at, right? It's really whatever it takes to get the job done, but those are probably the core tests that I run the most often.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people though to wrap their head around the investment that goes into it. So how do you explain to people, yeah, you have to invest in your health if you want to feel better. You can waste 5-10 years trying to do one thing at a time, or to spend a bunch of money right now and get results instead of just spinning your wheels.
Yeah, so I have usually a few responses to that. One is that I'll ask the client where they'd like to see themselves, say 6 months or a year from now. Mm-hmm. If they had a magic wand and they could make all of their symptoms disappear, right? How would they want their life to look if they were completely free of symptoms, right? Then I'll lead that into a follow-up question, which is, okay, so what will happen if you did nothing? Right? Yeah. What would life look like a year from now if you don't take action to do this kind of work, right? And to ultimately help yourself to get to the root cause of these issues, right? So that being said, I don't like to think of it as an expense. I think of it as an investment. There's never been a test that I've run on myself that didn't pay itself dividends back, time and time again, over and over again. So I would also say that if I were to add up the money I had spent over 10 or 15 years out of pocket, trying to kind of guess at what was going on with my health, trying out willy-nilly, just trying out supplements at the store because I read something online like, oh, quercetin might help with my allergies. Well, it's like, no, not if you're living in a moldy house. It's kind of like, I've heard this analogy before too. It's like having your mouth around the tailpipe, the exhaust pipe of the car. Thinking that supplements like something like quercetin or vitamin C, which have been shown to reduce histamine, and you'll see those kinds of exaggerated histamine responses with a mold issue. But again, if you're breathing in the exhaust from a car, supplements are going to do nothing. Like trying to put out a house fire with a garden hose. But I say all that because I had probably spent tens of thousands of dollars, right, with zero results, right? So yes, it is an investment, but like all investments, they return dividends back, and ultimately we're looking at restoring your health, right, and getting your life back, yeah. Right? Another thing I'll bring up is I'll ask someone like what they spend on average to fix their car. When their car breaks down, they wouldn't think twice about spending a couple grand or more on, because they need to get to work, right? Or how much someone might spend on a vacation between the flight, the hotel, entertainment, right? Several thousands of dollars, right? Easily, right? Yeah. And people often do that, if not once, maybe twice a year or more, right? The benefits of that vacation last you for the length that you're on that trip, 10 days, 2 weeks, or however long you're gone. But then, of course, you go right back to the grind and you're feeling terrible, right? So I like to make that comparison too, just to kind of create that mindset shift, right? That, we're actually looking at potentially kind of permanently, restoring your body or fixing your body and getting your life back. So you can't really put a dollar amount on that. This is kind of an opt-in elective form of self-care, right? So in most cases, insurance aren't going to cover these kinds of labs. But and I'm not a financial advisor or anything, but in my own case, at the time that I started this journey, I was broke. I was completely broke. I got a credit card. I put everything on a credit card. I said, I'm going to figure it out because my health is worth it. And I did, and when when I had that energy back, I was able to start a business. I was able to thrive. I was able to quickly pay off all the lab costs and the cost of my functional education easily, right? Because I then had that energy and mental clarity, and I was able to crush it, in my business and financial life. So that's another thing to consider too, is that your physiological health is kind of like the bottom tier of Maslow's hierarchy, right? And what I mean by that is that you can't really build. It's like kind of trying to build a house of cards, right? Like on sand, on shifting sand. If you're trying to build a business and relationships and your mental and spiritual health, if you don't have that physiological health first, it's not going to be very sustainable. So what I've learned through my own personal experience is you have to fix that first, and then it's much easier to kind of build on top of that.
So true. I was going to add in too, for those listeners that are cyclists or triathletes, how much they drop on buying a new bicycle. 10 grand easily. Yeah. And if you get a tri race bike, like I want a new Cervelo P5, P6, and you add race wheels, you're looking at 15,000. So
no idea.
So that's, the athletes do that. They don't even blink to buy a bike. They'll figure out how to pay for it. Like drop it on a credit card, whatever they can do. But to get people to do health coaching, spend money on labs, $1,000, that's way too much money to run all those labs. And so it's always funny to me, like, how much was that bike you just bought? Race wheels, that wetsuit you just bought, the new sunglasses you just bought for training, and it's just helmet. I mean, it costs so much money. I always joked about when I stopped doing Ironmans every year, I could go to Europe every year for 2 weeks and still save more money than I did spending on racing. So you have to prioritize your health sometimes. And that's why I want to talk about this more. When people are not racing, this is when you should be working on optimizing your health and working on your fitness level, but you have more time to take care of yourself and not be training and racing nonstop. So it's a good time of year, even, going into the fall, winter, when you can do all this stuff too, when it's not race season for most.
Exactly. And really, the best time for someone to think about doing this kind of work is actually when they are in good health, right? I wish more people would come to me when they're not dealing with any chronic health issues, right? Because unfortunately, so many people wait until serious happens, right? And then we have to but at that point, it's harder to dig yourself out of a hole than it is to be proactive, right? But we built kind of a model of healthcare in this country of not being proactive and preventive, right? So, in an ideal world, I wish more people would think about doing this kind of work to be preventative, and potentially to identify some signs or red flags of dysfunction in the body that may not have yet manifested into a serious issue, but could if you're continuing on the same path, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I know we're going to run out of time, so we'll have to have you come back on the show and dive into maybe some people who have questions for you. So, but where can they find you on social media, website, coaching with you?
Yeah, so they can find me at themindfulnutrivore.com, and also at the same handle on Instagram. So at themindfulnutrivore on Instagram, that's a good place to find me too. So feel free to write me on my website or DM me on Instagram. Happy to answer people's questions. I'm sure people will have a lot of questions about mold. It's a big topic, and would love to come back and dive into some of the deeper clinical nuances and details of illness.
Well, what we should do next time, I've been doing NutriSense. So the continuous glucose monitor, and I'm going to do a podcast with them. But what I don't think anyone's done before is look at how toxins, mold toxins, and other pathogens might cause your blood sugar levels to be higher and elevated during nighttime, because it's 24 hours a day. You've got this tracking, and it's fascinating. Just my first 4 days I've been doing this, that my blood sugar is higher at nighttime, and just looking like, and I'm looking up the liver clock at 2 to 3 a.m. in Chinese medicine. Does that mean your liver's working harder? The bugs are active more at nighttime, and so it's good to rabbit hole to dive in deeper. It's like, all right, how does your glucose and ability to burn fat get impacted with these different pathogens and mild dysbiosis and toxins, mold toxins, and all that?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because that is a common characteristic of mold illness. Is one of the kind of potential red flags or symptoms you would see is sleep disorders, kind of sleep dysfunction. So I do see a lot of people that are dealing with mold colonization or mycotoxins have this issue of trouble falling or staying asleep is really common.
Get them to do this and see what happens. We can start our own study.
I'm all about doing that R&D.
That's cool. All right. I know you have another session, and I do too. So I will wrap it up, and we'll talk to maybe next time more about mold illness. It'll be fun.
That's awesome. I would love to. Thanks, Debbie, for having me.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at debbiepotts.net. You can help us to continue to grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.